Good evening, dear friends. I'm Jake Walker, and this is the newest story on my channel.
Ethan Brooks came home to divorce papers lying beside a cold cup of coffee. But the silence that shattered him was not his wife leaving. It was the empty corner beside the fireplace where his German shepherd, Shadow, used to sleep. Weeks later, in the falling Montana snow, the old dog returned, wounded, thin, and carrying a path only his memory understood. Shadow did not lead Ethan toward revenge or buried secrets. He led him to a forgotten house, where lonely veterans still kept each other alive. Morning settled over White Pine, Montana, with a pale winter light that made the lake look like a sheet of old silver, and the pine-covered hills stand silent beneath a veil of frost. Ethan Brooks drove slowly along the narrow road that curved beside the water, his dark pickup moving past mailboxes, half buried in snow, closed summer cabins, and fences glazed white by the night wind. He was 61, tall and broad-shouldered, with the square frame of a man who had spent most of his life carrying weight without complaint. His hair, once black, had turned steel grey at the temples, and his beard was trimmed short, though not carefully enough to suggest vanity. The lines around his blue eyes were deep, carved by sun, salt water, sleepless nights, and things he had never fully explained to anyone. Nearly a year earlier, he had left Montana for Alaska, taking work as a security supervisor for an oil transport company, after telling himself that distance might give his marriage room to breathe. That was the lie men sometimes told when they were afraid to admit that home had become harder than storms. He had been a Navy SEAL for much of his younger life, the kind of man people called steady, capable, unbreakable. Though nobody who used those words ever seemed to ask what happened to a man after years of being useful in dangerous places. Ethan had learned how to enter dark buildings, survive rough seas, read the mood of a room before anyone spoke, and sleep lightly enough that the smallest sound could wake him. What he had not learned was how to sit across from his wife, Diane, and say, "I am scared. I am tired. I do not know how to come back." Diane Brooks was 59, a nurse at the small county clinic, with soft brown hair usually pinned low at the back of her neck, gentle gray eyes, and a patience that had once seemed endless. She was not fragile. No woman who had held the hands of dying patients for 30 years could be called fragile. But her kindness had slowly thinned under the weight of Ethan's silence, like fabric worn pale where it had been folded too many times. Ethan had heard it in her voice during their last calls, that careful politeness, that tired mercy. Still, as he turned into the driveway of the lake house, he carried a foolish hope inside him. He imagined opening the door, finding Diane in the kitchen, hearing the click of Shadow's nails on the wooden floor, feeling the old German shepherd's heavy head push against his thigh. Shadow was 9 years old, black and tan with a proud chest, amber eyes, a scar across one shoulder from an old hiking accident, and one ear that leaned slightly to the side when he was thinking too hard about human foolishness. Ethan used to say the dog had the soul of an old pastor and the appetite of a dock thief. Shadow had been more than a pet. He had been the bridge between husband and wife on the nights when words failed them. If Ethan woke, shaking from dreams he refused to describe, Shadow would press his body against the bed until the room became real again. If Diane cried quietly in the laundry room, Shadow would sit outside the door with the patience of a saint and the worried face of a tax auditor. Ethan parked beside the porch and cut the engine. The first thing he noticed was not the silence inside the house. It was the empty dog run near the side fence. The gate hung closed. Snow had drifted against the wire. No paw prints marked the yard. No dark shape lifted its head from the old cedar doghouse. Ethan stepped out, boots crunching against frozen gravel, and stood for a moment with one hand still on the truck door. "Shadow!" he called. The lake answered with a low slap against the shore. He climbed the porch steps. The blue paint on the front door had faded during the year he was gone. A wreath from some older season still hung crooked from a nail, brittle and brown, as if even decoration had lost the courage to pretend. Inside, the house was neat in a way that felt worse than disorder. The living room furniture remained in place, the plaid couch, the lamp with the cracked shade, the framed photograph of Ethan and Diane at Glacier National Park. But the room had been stripped of warmth. No boots by the door, no folded blanket on Diane's chair, no chew toy near the hearth. The place where Shadow's bed had always rested beside the fireplace was empty. The floorboards there lighter than the rest, holding the ghost shape of what had been removed. Ethan stared at that pale rectangle longer than he looked at anything else. Then he saw the papers on the kitchen table. They were squared neatly beneath the white coffee mug Diane used when she worked double shifts. His name was printed across the top in black legal letters. Ethan Michael Brooks. Diane Marie Brooks. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He did not touch the pages at first. Paper should not have weight, yet these few sheets seemed to pull the whole house downward. Beside them lay an envelope with his name written in Diane's careful handwriting. He opened it slowly. The letter was short. Diane wrote that she had loved him through deployments, hospitals, anniversaries spent alone, and nights when his body sat in their home while his mind listened for danger in places she could not see. She wrote that she was not leaving because she hated him. She was leaving because she no longer knew how to stay married to a man who vanished even when sitting across from her. Ethan lowered the letter. Anger would have been easier. Anger was a weapon with a handle. Shame had no handle. It simply entered the bones and sat there. He searched the house next, not for Diane, but for Shadow. Laundry room, mudroom, bedroom, back porch, shed. Empty. In the bedroom, Diane's side of the closet was cleared. His clothes remained folded, untouched, as if she had refused to punish him by destroying anything. When he stepped back outside, he found Walter Jenkins watching from the neighboring garage. Walter was 76, a Vietnam veteran with a lean, weathered body, a hawk-like nose, a white mustache, and pale eyes that looked permanently unimpressed by mankind. He owned the small repair garage near the lake and lived alone above it, spending his days fixing trucks, muttering at engines, and pretending he did not leave firewood on people's porches when snow got deep. War had made Walter sharp around the edges, but age had softened the middle in places he worked very hard to hide. "You're back," Walter said, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. Ethan looked toward the empty dog run. "Where's Shadow?" Walter's mouth tightened. He glanced at the lake, then at the house. "Summer festival. Fireworks over by Miller's Field. Loud ones. Dog got spooked bad. Diane opened the door thinking he'd run the yard and settle himself." Ethan's face did not change, but something inside him moved like ice cracking under weight. "And?" Walter exhaled. "He didn't come back." Ethan looked down at the snow. Walter's voice dropped. "She looked for him at first, put up notices, called the vet. Then I think she just ran out of strength." For a moment, Ethan wanted to blame her completely, because blame would give his grief a target. But the house behind him had already told the truth. Diane had been alone with his ghosts for years. Shadow had been alone with both of them. And Ethan had been far away, calling his absence work, calling his silence discipline, calling his fear anything except fear. He went back inside as afternoon faded. In the small storage closet near the back door, behind a box of winter gloves, he found Shadow's old collar. Brown leather, cracked at the buckle, with a dull metal tag that still read, Shadow Brooks. A few strands of black and golden fur clung to the inside. Ethan held it in both hands, as if it were something sacred pulled from a ruin. That night he sat alone on the porch while the lake moved in the dark below, black water whispering against the frozen shore. The collar rested in his lap. Above him, the Montana sky opened wide and cold, filled with stars that looked close enough for God to count by hand. Ethan Brooks, who had endured storms, gunfire, freezing seas, and years of being called strong, bowed his head over the last small proof that Shadow had once been home. And for the first time in many years, he wept without trying to stop himself. The first snow of the season arrived over White Pine with the quiet patience of something ancient returning to claim the mountains. By late afternoon, the pine trees around the lake stood wrapped in pale white, and smoke drifted lazily from chimneys across town, as though the whole valley were breathing slowly beneath the cold. Ethan Brooks woke before dawn inside Walter Jenkins's old guest cabin, a narrow wooden place tucked behind the repair garage near the lakeshore. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar, old coffee, cold iron, and the wood smoke that drifted through the cracks each winter no matter how much Walter cursed at the chimney. Ethan did not mind. He had slept in worse places during his years in the Navy. Besides, the silence inside the cabin felt cleaner than the silence inside the lake house he no longer considered home. The narrow cot creaked when he sat up. For a moment his body reacted the old way, shoulders tense, eyes scanning shadows, mind waiting for danger before memory returned and reminded him where he was. Montana. White Pine. Divorced. Alone. Missing dog. He rubbed one rough hand over his face and looked toward the floor near the stove without thinking. Empty. The absence struck him every morning now like touching a bruise to see if it still hurt. Outside, Walter was already awake, standing beneath the open garage door with a cigarette tucked behind one ear and a wrench in his hand. The old veteran wore a faded green army jacket over thick flannel, grease stains darkening the sleeves like old battle scars. Walter had the narrow hips and sharp shoulders of a man who had never fully regained the weight he lost in Vietnam. His white moustache twitched whenever he was annoyed, which was often, though Ethan had begun to suspect annoyance was simply the language Walter used instead of kindness. "Truck still dead," Walter muttered as Ethan approached. "Customer swears it only makes the noise on Tuesdays. Human beings are exhausting." Ethan almost smiled. Walter pointed toward the toolbox with his wrench. "You gonna stand there looking tragic or help me?" The work lasted most of the morning. Ethan found comfort in engines because machines did not hide their problems behind silence. Something cracked, leaked, froze, or failed. You fixed it or you didn't. Human beings were harder. Around noon, while Ethan tightened bolts beneath the hood of an old Ford pickup, he noticed someone sitting quietly near the back wall of the garage. A young girl, around 12 years old, sat cross-legged atop a wooden crate, sketchbook balanced on her knees. She had long chestnut hair braided loosely over one shoulder, pale skin dusted with freckles, and solemn hazel eyes too old for her age. She wore an oversized yellow sweater that likely once belonged to an adult, and heavy wool socks mismatched in color. The girl looked up only briefly before lowering her eyes again to continue drawing. "That's Lily," Walter said without turning around. "My granddaughter." His voice softened slightly around the last word, though only slightly. Ethan nodded toward the sketchbook. "She draw cars?" "Mostly animals," Walter grunted, "and birds, and sad-looking trees." Lily finally spoke without lifting her head. "Trees aren't sad. People just leave them alone too long. Ethan looked at Walter, but the old man suddenly became very interested in tightening a bolt that did not need tightening. Later, Ethan learned Lily had come to live with Walter 6 months earlier, after her mother, Walter's only daughter, died from cancer. Since then, the girl rarely spoke at school, avoided crowds, and spent most afternoons hiding in the garage with her drawings, while Walter pretended not to worry himself sick over her silence. Ethan recognized the look in her eyes immediately. It was the look of someone who had learned too early that the world could take things away without asking permission. That afternoon, Ethan drove into town with a stack of freshly printed posters beside him. Missing German Shepherd, Shadow, Black and Tan, Amber Eyes, Scar on right shoulder, Friendly but cautious. Beneath the photograph, he had typed one extra sentence before printing the pages. He is family. White pine in early winter looked almost painfully beautiful beneath the snow. Small diners glowed with yellow light. Church bells drifted softly across the valley. Elderly couples in heavy coats shuffled along sidewalks carrying grocery bags, while children threw snowballs near the hardware store. Ethan taped posters everywhere he could. Grocery entrance, feed store, gas station, library, coffee shop. Most people reacted kindly when they saw Shadow's photograph. A waitress with silver hair and bright red lipstick touched Ethan's arm gently and promised to keep watch. A mailman claimed he had seen a shepherd near the Western Hills 2 weeks earlier. A teenage boy at the gas station asked if there was a reward before losing interest entirely. Ethan learned quickly that grief exhausted people when it lasted longer than a polite conversation. Near sunset, he stopped at the White Pine Veterinary Clinic, a small brick building near the edge of town where warm yellow light spilled onto the snow-covered parking lot. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic, wet fur, pine cleaner, and coffee brewed too long ago. A golden retriever wearing a blue bandana slept near the counter, while an overweight orange cat glared hatefully from a carrier beside the wall. "Can I help you?" The voice belonged to a woman emerging from the back hallway carrying a clipboard. Emily Carter appeared to be in her early 40s, tall and lean with dark auburn hair tied into a loose knot that was already falling apart from a long day. Her skin was fair from Montana winters, though lightly freckled across the nose, and her green eyes carried the calm alertness of someone used to handling frightened animals and grieving people at the same time. She wore dark blue scrubs beneath a heavy grey cardigan, and one sleeve bore the faint paw print of something large and muddy. Ethan handed her one of the posters. Emily studied the photograph quietly. "Beautiful shepherd," she said softly. "Older dog?" 9. Emily nodded once. "I remember him." Ethan looked up sharply. "You do?" She motioned toward the counter. "A few years ago, winter storm. An old man brought him in with a torn paw. Big dog, very protective." Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. "Who was the man?" Emily frowned thoughtfully. "I don't remember his full name. Older veteran, white beard. Lived somewhere north near the mountain road." She glanced again at the photograph. "Your dog trusted him." That sentence lingered strangely in Ethan's mind. Emily copied the poster and pinned it beside the clinic door. Before Ethan left, she added gently, "Dogs remember safe places. Sometimes they go back to them when they're frightened." Outside, snow had begun falling harder, thick white flakes drifting beneath the streetlights as Ethan drove back toward the lake. Darkness gathered early across the pines. The road curved beside frozen water reflecting faint moonlight through the clouds. Halfway home, Ethan slowed the truck near the edge of the forest. Something moved between the trees. Then came the sound, a rough bark, hoarse, distant, familiar enough to stop Ethan's breathing entirely. He gripped the steering wheel and stared toward the black pine shadows where snow drifted silently through the branches. The bark came again, low and ragged, carrying across the frozen shoreline like a memory refusing to die. "Shadow?" Ethan whispered into the darkness, and for the first time since returning to White Pine, hope rose inside him sharp enough to hurt. Night settled heavily over White Pine, and the first real storm of winter drifted across the mountains, with slow, whispering snow that turned the pine forest into a ghostly sea of white and shadow. Ethan Brooks stood beside his truck near the frozen lakeshore road, barely breathing as the sound came again from the darkness between the trees. A bark. Hoarse, uneven, older somehow. Not the sharp, confident bark Shadow once used when chasing deer from the yard or demanding bacon from unsuspecting tourists. This sound carried exhaustion in it, and something else Ethan recognized immediately because he had heard it in soldiers after combat and in his own voice after too many sleepless nights. Fear. Ethan stepped away from the truck slowly, boots sinking into fresh snow. The cold wind moved through the pines with a low, mournful sound, carrying the scent of frozen earth and distant wood smoke. "Shadow," he called quietly, lowering his voice instinctively the way he once had during thunderstorms when the dog hid beside the fireplace. The trees ahead remained still. Then movement appeared between the trunks. A large shape emerged slowly from the falling snow. Ethan's chest tightened so violently, he thought for one strange moment that his heart had forgotten how to work. Shadow stood at the edge of the forest, thin enough that Ethan could see the faint outline of ribs beneath the thick black and tan coat. Snow clung to the fur along his back and muzzle. His right front leg touched the ground carefully, favoring an old injury or perhaps a new one. One ear twitched at the sound of the wind, while the other remained lowered slightly against his skull. The proud strength was still there, buried beneath exhaustion, but the dog looked older now, like winter itself had climbed onto his shoulders. Most painful of all were the eyes. Shadow's amber eyes no longer held simple joy. They held caution. He did not run forward. He watched Ethan carefully, body tense, as though love itself had become something uncertain. Ethan felt the ache of that more deeply than any wound he had carried out of war. "Easy, boy," he whispered, kneeling slowly in the snow. His knees soaked through immediately, cold biting into old scars beneath the denim. He held one gloved hand out, palm low and open. "It's me." Shadow took one hesitant step forward, then stopped again. The dog's breathing fogged white into the air. Ethan could see small cuts along the muzzle and a worn patch of fur near the collar where something had rubbed against the skin for too long. For a terrible second, Ethan feared Shadow might disappear back into the forest. Then a gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, and Shadow flinched hard enough that instinct overcame caution. The German shepherd limped forward through the snow and pressed his nose against Ethan's hand. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The touch nearly broke him. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Shadow inhaled deeply, smelling wool, cold air, engine oil, pine smoke, and the familiar scent of the man who had once been home. Then the dog made a sound Ethan had never heard before. A low, trembling whine pulled from somewhere deep inside him, and suddenly Shadow pushed forward fully into Ethan's arms. Ethan wrapped both arms around the dog's neck as snow drifted quietly around them. Shadow trembled violently against him. The old shepherd smelled of frost, wet fur, dirt, and survival. Ethan buried one hand in the thick fur along the dog's shoulder and felt how much weight he had lost. "You came back," he murmured brokenly. Jesus, Shadow. You came back. The drive to the veterinary clinic felt unreal. Shadow refused at first to climb into the truck, standing stiff beside the passenger door as though afraid the vehicle might carry him somewhere terrible. Ethan remembered suddenly how much the dog used to love rides along the lake. Shadow once rode with his head hanging out the window, ears flying wildly in the wind like some oversized, happy idiot. Now he hesitated at the open door with visible fear. Ethan reached behind the seat and found the old wool blanket Walter had loaned him for the cabin. He laid it carefully across the passenger floorboard. Shadow sniffed it once, then slowly climbed inside. White Pine Veterinary Clinic glowed warmly against the storm-dark snow when Ethan arrived. Emily Carter was already waiting beneath the porch light in her heavy winter coat, auburn hair half hidden beneath a knitted grey hat. She looked tired, though not in the fragile way some people carried exhaustion. Emily looked like the sort of woman who simply absorbed difficult things and kept moving anyway. Years of treating injured animals and comforting grieving families had placed a quiet steadiness inside her. "Bring him in," she said softly, after one look at Shadow. The examination room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender soap. Shadow stayed close beside Ethan's leg, moving stiffly across the floor while Emily worked patiently. She never rushed toward the dog or raised her voice. Ethan noticed how naturally she read frightened animals, giving them space before touching them. "Good boy," she murmured while examining Shadow's injured leg. "You've been through a rough season, haven't you?" Shadow tolerated the examination but remained tense. When Emily gently touched the worn fur around his neck, the shepherd growled low in warning. Ethan immediately placed one steady hand against the dog's shoulder. "Easy," he whispered. Emily withdrew calmly instead of forcing the issue. "Someone kept a rope or chain on him too long," she said quietly. "Not recently, I think, but long enough to rub the skin raw." Ethan's jaw tightened. Emily continued checking the dog carefully. Cracked paw pads, mild infection near the shoulder scar, dehydration, bruising along the ribs. Nothing fatal, but enough evidence to tell the story of a hard winter. "He survived outside for months," Emily said. "Not entirely alone, though." Ethan looked up sharply. Emily cleaned her hands at the sink before answering. "Dogs don't stay this alive in mountain winter without occasional help. Someone fed him at times. Maybe different people. Maybe one person. Hard to know." Ethan glanced down at Shadow, resting his head against Ethan's knee, now that the examination was ending. The dog's eyes had begun closing slowly, exhaustion finally winning over fear. Emily leaned lightly against the counter. "You don't sleep much either, do you?" Ethan frowned slightly. "What makes you say that?" "Your shoulders haven't relaxed once since you walked in. You keep checking the windows every few minutes. And when the heater kicked on back there, your hand moved toward your belt before you realized where you were." Ethan looked away toward the snowy parking lot outside. "Old habits." Emily nodded gently. "Old habits usually mean old pain." The room fell quiet except for the low hum of the heater. Ethan realized suddenly how long it had been since anyone spoke to him without either fear, pity, or careful distance. Emily handed him antibiotics and instructions for Shadow's recovery. "Warm place, small meals. Keep him close tonight." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Emily replied softly. "He's home, but he still thinks the world might hurt him." Back at the cabin, Walter met them outside beneath the falling snow. The old veteran stared at Shadow for several silent seconds before clearing his throat roughly. "Dog looks uglier than I remember." Shadow's tail moved weakly once. Walter nodded gruffly. Good. Still got enough pride left to judge me. Inside, Ethan spread blankets beside the stove while the fire crackled warmly through the tiny cabin. Shadow circled the room slowly before finally lowering himself near the heat with visible effort. For a while, Ethan simply sat beside him on the floor, one hand resting lightly against the dog's ribs to feel him breathing. Near midnight, the wind struck the cabin walls hard enough to rattle the windows. Shadow jerked awake instantly, body tense, ears pinned back in panic. Ethan leaned forward immediately. "It's all right," he whispered. "You're safe." Later, another gust hit the roof. Shadow startled again. Ethan did not sleep at all that night. Each time the wind howled outside, he sat beside the old shepherd in the firelight, speaking softly into the darkness while snow buried white pine deeper beneath the long Montana winter. The storms eased gradually over White Pine during the following weeks, though winter still held the mountains in a hard, white grip that made every breath feel sharpened by ice. Snow rested thick upon the pine branches around Walter's garage, and the frozen lake beyond the trees reflected the pale sky like cracked glass beneath morning light. Inside the small cabin, warmth had slowly returned in quiet pieces. The old stove crackled steadily now. A second coffee mug remained beside Ethan's each morning because Lily had developed the habit of stopping by before school. And Shadow, though still limping slightly, had begun sleeping without jerking awake at every sound. Ethan noticed the change in the dog little by little. The shepherd's coat regained some shine. The ribs no longer pressed sharply beneath the fur. His amber eyes softened during quiet moments near the fire, though certain sounds still sent tension through his body like electricity. Wind rattling loose metal. Sudden shouting outside the garage. Fireworks on television commercials. Shadow would immediately lift his head, ears rigid, muscles tight beneath his skin. Ethan understood those reactions too well. Healing, he had learned long ago, was rarely a straight road. Lily visited nearly every afternoon now. The 12-year-old girl had grown less ghost-like in recent weeks. Her chestnut hair remained loosely braided over one shoulder, and her oversized sweaters still hung from her thin frame. But she smiled more often around Shadow. Sometimes Ethan caught her laughing softly when the shepherd snored loudly beside the stove, or barked in his sleep while chasing imaginary enemies. Walter pretended not to notice these small changes, though Ethan often saw the old veteran watching from the garage doorway with an expression that looked dangerously close to hope. One cold afternoon, Lily sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, sketching Shadow, while the dog rested his massive head across her boots. "He looks wiser when he's asleep," she said quietly. Ethan glanced down from the engine part he was cleaning. "That's because he can't make bad decisions while unconscious." Lily smiled faintly. "Grandpa says you used to jump out of airplanes into oceans." "Sometimes." "Why?" Ethan thought about that longer than he expected. "Because when I was younger," he said slowly, "I believed if you kept moving long enough, nothing painful could catch you." Lily looked down at her drawing again. "Did it work?" Ethan watched Shadow breathing beside the stove. "No," he answered honestly. That evening, Walter lingered unusually long after closing the garage. He stood outside the cabin smoking one of his cheap cigarettes, while snow drifted lazily beneath the porch light. "Girl laughs more around here," he muttered without looking directly at Ethan. "That's good." Ethan leaned against the porch railing. "She's a good kid." Walter nodded once. "Her mama used to laugh like that before she got sick." His voice roughened slightly around the last word. Walter rarely spoke about his daughter. Ethan knew only fragments. Breast cancer, too late when they found it, a husband who disappeared before the funeral. Since then, Walter had raised Lily alone, despite barely understanding how to care for himself. "You're helping more than you realize," Walter added quietly before crushing the cigarette beneath his boot and walking away before gratitude could embarrass either of them. Shadow's strange behavior began 2 mornings later. Ethan had just opened the cabin door before sunrise when the shepherd suddenly froze beside him. The cold air carried the distant smell of pine smoke drifting from somewhere high in the northern mountains. Shadow lifted his head sharply, ears forward, body tense, not with fear this time, but recognition. He stepped into the snow immediately, limping toward the tree line. "Shadow?" Ethan called. The dog paused, but did not return. Instead, he stared northward toward the dark mountain ridges. Later that same day, a gust of wind stirred the small metal chimes hanging outside Walter's garage office. The faint ringing sound echoed across the snowy yard. Shadow reacted instantly. He rose so quickly from beside the stove that his injured leg slipped briefly against the wooden floor. Ethan steadied him automatically. The shepherd stood staring toward the sound with strange intensity, tail low, ears rigid, breathing faster now. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan asked softly. Shadow gave a quiet, restless whine. Over the next several days, the behavior repeated whenever wind carried certain smells or sounds down from the northern hills. Smoke, wind chimes, sometimes even the distant church bells drifting across white pine during evening snowfall. Each time Shadow became alert, pacing toward the cabin door as though some invisible thread tugged gently at his memory. Emily Cotter noticed it too during one of her follow-up visits. She knelt beside Shadow near the stove while checking the healing wound on his leg. "Dogs remember through scent more strongly than anything else," she said thoughtfully. "Places, people, fear, safety." Ethan watched Shadow carefully. "You think he's trying to go somewhere?" Emily brushed a loose strand of auburn hair behind one ear. "I think part of him already knows where he wants to go." The following morning dawned gray and still beneath heavy clouds. Ethan planned to spend the day helping Walter repair a damaged snowplow engine, but the moment he stepped outside, Shadow moved toward the truck with determined urgency. Not excited, certain. Ethan frowned slightly. "We're not going anywhere today." Shadow looked back at him once. Then the shepherd began walking toward the old northern logging road leading into the mountains. Ethan sighed quietly. "All right," he muttered. "You've earned one bad idea." The road climbed gradually beyond white pine, through dense pine forest buried beneath untouched snow. Ethan drove slowly, while Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, unusually alert despite the rough terrain. Every few minutes the dog lifted his nose toward the cracked window, inhaling deeply as though following something only he could sense. The farther north they traveled, the narrower the road became. Eventually, Ethan parked near a fallen pine blocking the path. Shadow immediately jumped from the truck and continued uphill through the snow. Ethan followed on foot. The mountain forest around them stood silent, except for wind moving through the trees with a low whispering sound. Snow reached nearly to Ethan's knees in places. Shadow moved carefully but steadily, leading him higher along what appeared to be an old forgotten trail. Nearly an hour later, the trees finally opened. Ethan stopped abruptly. A weathered wooden house stood alone atop the snowy hill. The place looked ancient against the white landscape, built from dark pine logs blackened by years of winter storms. One side of the roof sagged slightly beneath heavy snow. A narrow porch wrapped around the front beneath strings of rusted wind chimes that shifted softly in the mountain breeze. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, yet the house did not feel abandoned. It felt waiting. Shadow climbed the porch steps slowly and stopped beside the front door. Ethan noticed old paw scratches near the wood frame. Not recent, repeated. The shepherd lowered his head briefly against the door before glancing back toward Ethan. Ethan pushed the door open carefully. Cold air rolled outward, carrying the scent of old cedar, ashes, dust, and faint traces of dog fur. Inside, the cabin remained frozen in quiet stillness. Several worn chairs surrounded a stone fireplace. Old blankets rested folded atop a wooden trunk. Tin mugs sat neatly beside the kitchen sink. On one wall hung faded photographs of older men in hunting coats standing beside snowmobiles, dogs, and campfires beneath winter mountains. Shadow moved confidently through the room, as though memory guided every step. Then Ethan noticed the notebook resting atop a table near the fireplace. Its leather cover had faded badly with age. Snowflakes melted slowly from Ethan's coat as he opened it carefully. The pages inside contained names, dates, notes written in different handwriting. Families stranded during storms, hunters lost in blizzards, travelers needing shelter. Then Ethan saw the word written near the bottom of one page in faded black ink. Shadow. The name appeared again several pages later, and again. Ethan stared silently at the notebook while the old wind chimes outside whispered softly through the mountain air. And beside him, Shadow stood quietly in the center of the forgotten house, like a creature finally returned to somewhere sacred. Snow drifted softly across the northern mountains above White Pine, while evening settled through the pine forest in long blue shadows. The old house on the hill stood silent beneath the fading sky, its weathered logs dark against the snow as wind chimes whispered faintly from the porch roof. Ethan Brooks remained standing beside the wooden table, staring down at the faded notebook in his hands, while Shadow moved slowly through the cabin, as though walking inside an old memory. The shepherd paused near the stone fireplace and lowered himself carefully onto the worn rug, his amber eyes fixed not on Ethan, but on the hallway leading deeper into the house. Ethan turned another page. More names, more storms. December 2009. Couple stranded during blizzard, shared soup and blankets. February 2013. Veteran named Cole slept here 3 nights after losing truck near Miller Pass. Then, farther down the page, written in rough, dark ink, Shadow came again during heavy snow. Waited by the south window until morning. Gave him stew. Dog refused to leave until storm passed. Ethan swallowed slowly. The realization settled heavily inside him. Shadow had not found this place once by accident. He had returned here again and again. A floorboard creaked suddenly somewhere behind him. Ethan's body reacted instantly before thought caught up. Years of military instinct snapped through him like a wire pulled tight. He turned sharply toward the hallway. An older man stood near the kitchen doorway, carrying an armload of split firewood against his chest. The stranger froze at once. He appeared to be somewhere in his late 70s, tall, despite the stoop age had placed upon his shoulders, with a broad chest beneath a heavy wool coat, faded nearly white at the seams. His beard was thick and silver-gray, rough around the edges like winter brush along a mountain road. Deep lines cut across his weathered face, especially around the eyes, where years of cold wind and disappointment had left their marks. Yet his pale blue eyes remained sharp and strangely calm. The man's left leg dragged slightly when he stepped forward, an old injury perhaps, though he carried himself with the stubborn balance of someone who refused to surrender dignity to pain. Shadow rose immediately. Ethan stiffened, expecting either aggression or fear. Instead, the shepherd crossed the room slowly and pressed his head gently against the old man's coat. The man's expression softened so completely it seemed to change his entire face. "Well now," he murmured in a low, gravelly voice. "Thought you might have frozen yourself into a ghost this winter." He set the firewood down carefully and scratched behind Shadow's ear with practiced familiarity. Shadow leaned into the touch without hesitation. Ethan lowered the notebook slowly. "You know him?" The old man glanced toward Ethan. No aversion of him. His mouth twitched faintly beneath the beard. "Though this one looks skinnier than I remember. You Ethan Brooks?" Ethan nodded cautiously. "Who are you?" "Harold Bennett." The old man extended one rough hand. "Korean War veteran, terrible cook, occasional liar when fishing season starts." Ethan shook his hand. Harold's grip remained surprisingly strong. "You own this place?" Harold glanced around the cabin quietly before answering. "Not exactly. Belonged to a friend of mine named Roy Mercer. Passed away 3 winters ago." His voice lowered slightly at the last sentence. "After Roy died, somebody had to keep the roof standing." Harold moved through the cabin naturally, placing logs into the fireplace while speaking. It became obvious quickly that he knew every inch of the old house. He lit the fire with practiced movements, and soon warmth spread through the frozen room while shadows flickered softly against the walls. Ethan noticed how Shadow relaxed visibly near the old man, the shepherd's breathing slowing as though some deep piece of fear had eased simply by returning here. Harold sat heavily in one of the wooden chairs near the fire and motioned for Ethan to do the same. "Roy started this place back in the 80s, he explained. "Winter storms got bad some years. Folks stranded up in the mountains. Old veterans sleeping in trucks. People too proud to ask for help." Harold shrugged slightly. "Roy figured pride matters less when somebody's freezing to death." Ethan listened quietly while firelight danced across the room. Harold continued, "Eventually word spread, not publicly, quietly. People knew there'd be soup here, blankets, dry boots. Nobody asking too many questions." Ethan glanced again at the notebook. "And Shadow?" Harold smiled faintly. "Smart dog." The old veteran leaned back slowly, joints stiff with age. "First time he showed up was maybe 4 years ago during a blizzard. Scratched at the porch door near midnight. Nearly scared Roy into dropping his coffee." Shadow lifted his head at the sound of his name. Harold's expression softened again. "Dog sat right there by the fireplace all night. Next morning, Roy drove him back down toward town after the roads cleared." Ethan stared into the fire silently. Harold watched him carefully for a moment before speaking again. "Then he came back." Ethan looked up. Harold nodded slowly. "Not every week, sometimes months apart, usually after storms, sometimes after fireworks near town, sometimes after—" He paused gently. "Hard nights, I think." The words settled heavily between them. Ethan suddenly remembered the cold silences inside the lake house. Diane crying quietly in another room, Shadow pacing restlessly near the back door, while Ethan buried himself inside old anger and exhaustion he never knew how to explain. Harold's voice remained calm, never accusing. "Dogs know when a house hurts," he said quietly. "Especially shepherds. They carry everybody's pain, whether it belongs to them or not." Ethan looked down at his hands. The shame inside him felt strangely different now. Less sharp, more honest. Harold rose slowly and disappeared into another room before returning carrying a faded photograph in a cracked wooden frame. "Thought maybe you should see this." Ethan took the frame carefully. The photograph showed several older men standing together on this very porch during a heavy snowstorm years earlier. Some wore hunting jackets, others army coats or thick flannel shirts. Every face looked weathered by age and difficult winters. In the center of the picture sat Shadow, younger and healthier, thick fur dusted with snow. Around his neck was a ridiculous bright red scarf tied loosely beneath one ear. Ethan blinked in surprise. "The scarf?" Harold chuckled softly. "Roy gave him that. Said every respectable mountain dog deserved one foolish article of clothing." For the first time in weeks, Ethan laughed quietly. The sound startled even him. Shadow thumped his tail once against the floorboards. Harold studied Ethan for a moment before speaking again. "You know," he said, "that dog coming here wasn't betrayal." Ethan's smile faded slowly. Harold nodded toward Shadow. "He loved you. Still does. But sometimes creatures go searching for peace where they can find it." Outside, the wind moved through the mountains with a low, mournful sound, while snow drifted steadily across the porch. Ethan looked again at the photograph. Shadow sitting proudly among old, forgotten veterans beneath storm-dark skies, wearing a red scarf like some stubborn guardian spirit of the mountains. For the first time since returning to White Pine, Ethan realized Shadow had not spent those missing months simply surviving. Somehow, the old shepherd had been finding his way back to people who understood loneliness almost as deeply as Ethan himself. Snow fell lightly over White Pine that afternoon, soft enough to blur the edges of the town without fully covering it, as though winter itself had grown weary of carrying storms. Ethan Brooks drove slowly through the narrow streets, with Shadow lying quietly in the back seat beneath Walter's old wool blanket. The German shepherd had been unusually restless all morning after leaving Harold Bennett's mountain house. Twice during breakfast he had walked to the cabin door and stared toward town with uneasy eyes, whining softly low in his throat. Ethan understood the feeling. Some roads waited for a man long before he gathered the courage to walk them. Diane's apartment building stood near St. Mary's Regional Hospital on the east side of White Pine, a plain two-story structure with beige siding, narrow balconies, and snow piled neatly along the walkways by maintenance workers already tired of winter. The place looked temporary in a way that hurt Ethan unexpectedly. No flower boxes, no porch swing, no traces of permanence. Just a place where people stayed while trying to survive difficult years. Ethan sat inside the truck for several moments before turning off the engine. Shadow lifted his head immediately. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured quietly. The dog watched him with calm but alert eyes, as if sensing where they were before Ethan even stepped outside. Diane opened the apartment door after the second knock. For one fragile second, neither of them spoke. She looked smaller somehow than Ethan remembered, though perhaps grief simply changed the shape of people over time. Diane Brooks still carried the same soft beauty she had when they first met, 30 years earlier in San Diego, before deployments and winter silences hollowed parts of their marriage away. Her brown hair, streaked now with silver near the temples, rested loosely around her shoulders instead of pinned neatly for work. She wore pale blue nursing scrubs beneath a gray cardigan too large for her frame, and exhaustion lived openly in her face now, especially around the eyes. Ethan realized with sudden shame how often he used to look at her without truly seeing her. Diane's gaze moved past him toward the truck immediately. Her hand tightened against the edge of the door. "Shadow?" she whispered. Ethan nodded once. "He's here." Something inside her face broke softly. Not dramatically, not like movies. More like a woman who had been holding a heavy object for too long and suddenly realized she no longer had the strength. "Bring him inside," she said quietly. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee, clean laundry, and the lemon soap hospitals always seemed to use. Everything inside remained painfully orderly. Medical journals stacked neatly beside the couch, Shoes lined carefully near the door, a single lamp glowing softly near the window. Ethan noticed there were no framed photographs anywhere. No family pictures. No signs that someone expected happiness to stay long enough for decoration. Shadow entered slowly, claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. He paused in the middle of the living room, watching Diane carefully. For one terrible second, Ethan wondered if the shepherd might still carry fear from the night he disappeared. Then Diane sank slowly onto the couch, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered brokenly. Shadow crossed the room immediately and rested his massive head gently against her lap. Diane let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob as her hands buried themselves into the thick fur around his neck. Tears slid freely down her cheeks now. "I thought you were dead," she whispered into the dog's coat. "God, Shadow, I thought the mountain took you." Ethan stood quietly near the kitchen doorway, feeling strangely like an intruder in his own life. Diane wiped at her face after a moment and looked up toward him. "You found him." "He found me," Ethan answered softly. Silence settled briefly between them. Not the angry silence their marriage had drowned inside for years. This one felt older, sadder. Diane stroked Shadow's ears slowly while gathering herself. "Walter told me you came back." Ethan nodded. "A while ago." "And you're staying in his cabin?" "For now." Diane lowered her eyes toward Shadow again. "He always liked Walter." Ethan almost smiled faintly. "Walter insults him constantly." "That's how Walter says hello." The small joke faded quickly, leaving the heavier truth waiting underneath. Ethan finally spoke first. "Harold Bennett told me Shadow used to disappear into the mountains sometimes." Diane's hand froze briefly against the dog's fur. There it was, the slight tightening around her mouth, the old pain. "You found the mountain house," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Diane leaned back slowly against the couch cushions, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the window where snow drifted past the glass. "I wondered if you eventually would." Ethan remained standing. Sitting felt too much like surrender right now. "Why didn't you tell me?" Diane closed her eyes briefly before answering. "Because by the end, I was ashamed of too many things." The room grew still except for the soft hiss of the heating vents. Diane spoke quietly now, not defensive, only tired in the deepest possible way. "The night Shadow disappeared was the worst night we ever had." Ethan felt his chest tighten. Diane continued staring toward the snow outside. "You were in Alaska. We hadn't spoken properly in weeks. Every conversation felt like I was talking to someone standing behind a locked door." She swallowed hard. "The fireworks started near the lake around 9. Shadow panicked almost immediately." Ethan remembered those summer festivals, loud enough to shake windows across town. Diane's voice trembled slightly now. "He kept pacing the house, whining, scratching the doors. I tried everything, music, treats, sitting beside him." She gave a small, broken laugh. "At one point, I was sitting on the kitchen floor crying while your dog tried to protect both of us from fireworks." Ethan looked down silently. "I called you twice," Diane said. The sentence landed heavily between them. Ethan remembered seeing missed calls later that night in Alaska after finishing security rounds near the oil docks. He had stared at the screen, exhausted and emotionally numb, then convinced himself he would call the next morning. He never had. "I know," he admitted quietly. Diane nodded once without anger. Shadow kept throwing himself at the back door every time another firework exploded. And suddenly Her voice broke. I couldn't do it anymore, Ethan. Tears slid down her face again while Shadow leaned more heavily against her legs, as if trying to hold her together physically. I opened the door because I thought he'd run into the yard and calm down like before. But he just kept running. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Diane wiped her face with trembling fingers. I looked for him the next day, and the day after that. She laughed weakly through tears. I drove mountain roads in my nursing scrubs calling for a dog while people stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Ethan remained silent because anything he said would arrive years too late. Diane looked toward him finally, eyes swollen red now. The awful part is, eventually I stopped looking. Why? Ethan asked softly. Diane's answer came almost immediately. Because I was already losing everything else, too. The words struck harder than blame ever could have. She looked around the apartment helplessly. I spent years trying to keep our marriage alive while you disappeared deeper into yourself every season. And Shadow. Her hand moved slowly along the dog's back. Shadow kept trying to save us. Ethan frowned slightly. Diane nodded toward the shepherd. Every time you had nightmares, he'd stay beside you until morning. Every time we fought, he'd sit between us. If I cried in the laundry room, he'd scratch at the door until I let him in. Her voice cracked completely now. That dog spent years trying to hold our family together. Ethan looked down at Shadow lying peacefully beside Diane and suddenly understood why the old shepherd had kept returning to Harold's mountain house. The dog had been carrying the grief of two broken people for longer than either of them realized. Ethan stepped quietly toward the couch. I'm sorry, he said, and for once the words contained no defensiveness, no attempt to escape guilt. Just truth. Diane covered her face briefly as sobs overtook her. Shadow immediately lifted himself onto the couch despite his healing leg and gently rested his head across her knees. Diane wrapped both arms around him and cried openly into his fur, while snow drifted silently beyond the apartment windows, and Ethan stood nearby, feeling, for the first time in many years, the full, unbearable weight of what silence had cost them all. Morning arrived slowly over the northern mountains, pale gray light spreading across the snow-covered ridges, while cold wind drifted through the pine forest surrounding Harold Bennett's forgotten house. During the night, another layer of snow had settled quietly upon the roof, softening the world outside until the mountains themselves looked distant and dreamlike beyond the frosted windows. Ethan Brooks woke before sunrise beside the fireplace where Shadow slept, stretched across the worn rug, one ear twitching faintly each time sparks cracked inside the flames. For a long moment, Ethan simply watched the old shepherd breathing. Peace still looked unfamiliar on the dog, as if Shadow expected someone to take it away if he relaxed too deeply. Ethan understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. Harold was already awake in the kitchen, standing beside an old iron stove heating coffee in a battered metal pot, blackened by decades of fire. The old veteran moved carefully because of his injured leg, but there was still strength beneath the stiffness. His broad shoulders remained solid despite age, and his large, weathered hands carried the scars of cold winters, war, hard labor, and too many years fixing broken things without asking for help. "Coffee's terrible," Harold muttered as Ethan entered, "but it's hot enough to forgive itself." Ethan accepted the mug. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke, old books, and the faint wool scent carried by blankets drying near the fire. Shadow lifted his head when Ethan sat down at the table, then settled again once reassured everything remained calm. Harold nodded toward the notebook lying beside Ethan's elbow. "You were reading late." Ethan ran one thumb across the cracked leather cover. "There's years of names in here." Harold lowered himself carefully into the opposite chair. Roy kept records because he worried memory disappears faster than people do. Ethan opened another section of pages. More entries appeared in different handwriting styles, some careful and neat, others shaky from old age or injury. January 2011. Delivered firewood to widow near Miller Creek. February 2012. Helped rescue rancher trapped during avalanche near Black Ridge. December 2014. Brought canned food to trailer family after heating failed. Ethan looked up slowly. "You all did this yourselves?" Harold shrugged faintly. "Most folks in White Pine think old veterans just sit around talking about fishing and blood pressure." His pale eyes narrowed slightly with dry humor. "Turns out some of us got bored." But beneath the joke lived something deeper. Ethan could feel it now while turning the pages. These men had built a quiet, invisible network through the mountains over decades. Not charities, not organizations, just lonely people keeping other lonely people alive through hard winters. Harold leaned back carefully in his chair. "A lot of men came home from wars and discovered the country knew how to celebrate soldiers, but not how to live beside damaged ones afterward." His gaze drifted briefly toward the fire. "Some drank themselves into the ground, some disappeared into mountains, some just got old and tired." Ethan listened silently. Harold continued, "Roy figured if the government wasn't going to save forgotten people, maybe forgotten people could save each other instead." Shadow suddenly lifted his head and walked toward the old notebook resting near Ethan's hand. The shepherd pressed his nose gently against one specific page. Ethan frowned slightly before looking down. A name had been circled there years earlier in faded blue ink. Shadow. Beside it, someone had written, "Brought old Mr. Talbot up here during blizzard after finding him collapsed near the logging road. Smartest damn dog in Montana." Ethan stared at the sentence while something strange tightened in his chest. "He led people here." Harold smiled softly beneath his silver beard. "More than once." Ethan looked up sharply. Harold nodded toward Shadow. "Dogs know loneliness when they smell it. Roy used to swear Shadow could sense broken hearts, same way hunting dogs sense storms." Ethan almost laughed quietly at that, but the notebook continued proving Harold wasn't exaggerating much. Entry after entry mentioned the shepherd appearing beside stranded travelers, elderly widowers, frightened drifters, even once a teenage runaway freezing near the mountain highway. Somehow, Shadow always guided them toward the old house. "Jesus," Ethan murmured. "He became part of the place." Harold's expression softened. "No, the place became part of him." Around noon, Lily arrived unexpectedly, with Walter driving the old pickup slowly through the snowstorm beginning outside. The girl stepped into the cabin, carrying a paper bag full of canned soup and bread from town, while snowflakes clung to her chestnut braid and oversized green coat. "Grandpa said old people forget to eat," she announced quietly, while setting the food on the counter. Harold snorted softly. "That man insults me by bringing groceries." Walter entered behind her, carrying more firewood against his chest. The old Vietnam veteran glanced around the cabin suspiciously, as though uncomfortable inside places carrying too much emotion. "House still standing," he muttered. "Disappointing." But Ethan noticed Walter's eyes lingering briefly on the old photographs near the fireplace. Men in military jackets smiling beside snowmobiles, campfires, dogs. Some faces looked painfully familiar to him. Not personally, spiritually. Men who survived too much and grew old carrying invisible weather inside them. While the men spoke quietly near the stove, Lily wandered toward a wooden cabinet near the hallway. "What's this?" she asked softly. Harold turned. "Probably Roy's old junk." Lily carefully opened the cabinet doors anyway. Inside rested dozens of rolled drawings and paintings tied with faded ribbon. She pulled one out slowly. The paper trembled slightly in her hands before she unrolled it across the table. Ethan froze. The sketch showed the lake near White Pine during autumn sunset. The style was delicate but alive with emotion. Pine trees leaning above dark water, orange light across the shore. And near the bottom corner, signed in small, neat handwriting, Claire Jenkins. Walter stopped moving entirely. Lily stared down at the signature with widening eyes. "That's Mom's name." Silence filled the cabin instantly. Walter removed his hat slowly, weathered face tightening around the jaw. Harold looked equally surprised. "Claire used to come here sometimes," he admitted quietly. Lily looked up. "Mom knew this place?" Harold nodded slowly. "After your grandmother died. Claire spent a lot of time helping Roy sort supplies. She painted up here when things got hard." Walter stared at the sketch without blinking. Ethan suddenly understood something important. Walter had never known how much his daughter needed places like this either. Lily carefully unrolled another drawing, then another. Mountain sunsets, snow-covered trails. Shadow sitting proudly beside the fireplace, years younger with the ridiculous red scarf around his neck. Lily's eyes filled slowly with tears, though she smiled at the same time. "She was happy here," the girl whispered. Harold's rough old face softened. "Your mama laughed a lot in this house." Walter looked away quickly toward the window, because old soldiers often preferred weather to tears. Later, as afternoon faded blue across the mountains, Ethan stepped outside onto the porch beside Harold, while snow drifted steadily through the trees. Shadow followed quietly, sitting beside Ethan beneath the hanging wind chimes. The old shepherd looked out across the mountains, as though guarding something invisible there. Ethan folded his arms against the cold. "I thought finding Shadow meant bringing him home." Harold leaned carefully against the porch railing. "Maybe." He watched the falling snow for several seconds before speaking again. "But I think that dog's been trying to do something bigger than finding his own home." Ethan glanced down at Shadow. Harold's pale eyes rested calmly on the shepherd. "That dog isn't just leading people out of storms," he said quietly. "He's leading them toward where they belong." The wind chimes whispered softly overhead while snow continued falling across the forgotten mountain house, and for the first time in many years, Ethan Brooks felt something inside himself begin turning slowly toward warmth instead of war. The storm arrived before dawn, like something alive crossing the mountains. By sunrise, the sky above White Pine had disappeared beneath a wall of gray-white snow clouds, rolling low over the valley, and the wind screamed through the pine forests hard enough to shake windows along the lakeshore. Snow fell sideways in thick, violent sheets, swallowing roads, fences, and entire stretches of forest beneath moving curtains of white. Ethan Brooks stood outside Walter's garage with his coat collar pulled high against the wind, while Shadow paced restlessly beside him, ears pinned back beneath the storm howl. The German shepherd had been uneasy since the middle of the night. Twice he had woken Ethan by pacing near the cabin door and growling softly toward the mountains. Dogs knew storms before men admitted them. Walter emerged from the garage carrying truck keys and wearing his heavy canvas coat lined with sheep wool. The old veteran looked irritated, in the stubborn way men sometimes did when frightened but unwilling to show it. Snow already clung to his white mustache and thick eyebrows. "Road Commission says the East Highway might close by afternoon," he grunted. "Lily's asthma medicine's running low." Ethan frowned immediately. "Then wait until tomorrow." Walter snorted. "Tomorrow this whole town might be buried." He shoved the keys into his pocket. "Pharmacy's still open for now." Ethan looked toward the swirling road beyond the lake. "I'll go." "No." Walter's voice came sharp with old pride. "I've driven these roads since before you learned to shave." Ethan recognized that tone. Soldiers who survived war often mistook stubbornness for immortality. Before he could argue again, Lily appeared near the garage doorway, wrapped in a thick green sweater and wool socks, her pale face already worried. "Grandpa," she said softly, "you don't have to." Walter immediately softened his voice for her without realizing it. "Just medicine run, kiddo." He forced a rough smile beneath the storm wind. "Try not to redecorate the garage while I'm gone." Lily hugged herself tightly while watching him climb into the old pickup truck. Ethan noticed how her eyes followed Walter the same way children watched hospital doors after bad news. Fear had taught her early that people sometimes left and never returned. The truck disappeared slowly into the white storm. By noon, White Pine had nearly vanished beneath snow. The roads closed one by one. Power flickered across town. Pine branches snapped loudly in the forest under the weight of ice and wind. Ethan remained near the cabin windows, watching the storm worsen, while Shadow paced endlessly between the door and fireplace. The shepherd's anxiety infected the entire room. Lily sat curled beneath a blanket near the stove, trying to sketch in her notebook, but her pencil shook slightly against the paper. Emily Carter arrived shortly after noon, driving her old Subaru carefully through the storm with medical supplies stacked in the back seat. Snow covered her dark blue winter coat and knitted gloves when she entered the cabin. Her auburn hair had escaped from beneath her hat in damp curls around her face, and cold reddened her cheeks sharply, though her green eyes remained calm and focused. "Hospitals preparing emergency shelters," she said while removing her gloves. "Road crews lost visibility near Miller Pass." Ethan looked immediately toward the window. "Walter should have been back an hour ago." Emily's expression tightened slightly. Lily lowered her sketchbook slowly. "Grandpa always comes back," she whispered, though the sentence sounded less like confidence and more like prayer. Ethan stepped outside twice during the afternoon, searching for headlights through the storm, but saw nothing except endless white wind tearing across the frozen lake. By evening, the cabin generator became their only electricity after the power failed completely. Snow hammered the roof, while darkness swallowed the valley. Lily sat quietly beside Shadow now, one small hand buried in the shepherd's thick fur, as if anchoring herself against panic. Emily prepared soup on the old stove, while Ethan checked road maps spread across the kitchen table. "If Walter got stranded," Ethan said quietly, "he probably tried cutting through the northern logging road to avoid closures." Emily looked up sharply. "That pass becomes dangerous during heavy accumulation." Ethan nodded once. "I know." Shadow suddenly lifted his head from beside Lily. Every muscle in the dog's body tightened at once. He moved toward the cabin door, whining low and urgently. Ethan looked toward him immediately. "What is it?" Shadow scratched once against the wood, then stared toward the mountains. Ethan felt something cold settle deep inside his chest. "He knows," Lily whispered softly. Ethan grabbed his winter gear without another word. Emily stepped toward him instantly.
You can't go alone in this storm.
I don't have a choice.
Then I'm coming too.
Ethan looked at her. Emily crossed her arms stubbornly beneath the lantern light.
I spent 4 years volunteering mountain rescue after college. I know hypothermia signs better than most paramedics.
Ethan almost argued. Then another blast of wind rattled the cabin hard enough to shake snow from the roof. Time mattered more than pride.
Stay with Lily,
he said quietly instead. Emily looked ready to refuse, until Lily suddenly clutched her sleeve tightly. The girl's face had gone pale beneath the firelight.
Please don't leave too,
she whispered. Emily's expression softened instantly. She knelt beside Lily and brushed damp hair gently from the girl's forehead.
I'm staying.
Ethan watched the scene briefly before stepping toward the door. Shadow stood waiting already, muscles tense with purpose. Outside, the storm hit like a living wall. Wind clawed at Ethan's coat, while snow reduced visibility to only a few feet. The old snowmobile Walter kept behind the garage roared reluctantly to life beneath Ethan's hands after several tries. Shadow climbed behind him immediately without hesitation. Ethan pulled goggles over his eyes and drove north into the white darkness. The mountain road had nearly disappeared beneath drifting snow. Twice Ethan barely avoided sliding into buried ditches hidden beneath the storm. Branches cracked overhead like distant rifle fire. Shadow remained alert the entire ride, standing against the rushing wind, with his nose lifted constantly toward the storm. After nearly 40 minutes, Ethan found the first sign. Tire tracks. Faint and half-covered already. Walter's truck had skidded badly near a sharp curve along the northern ridge road. Ethan killed the engine and crouched low against the snow. Years of SEAL training returned automatically now, cold focus replacing panic. He studied the terrain carefully. Broken branches, fresh snow collapse near the roadside. Then he saw it. A section of guardrail bent downward toward the ravine. "Walter," Ethan breathed. Shadow barked sharply once and lunged downhill through chest-deep snow. Ethan followed immediately. The ravine below looked almost invisible beneath drifting white. 20 feet down the slope, half buried beneath snow and broken pine limbs, rested Walter's truck tilted sideways against a cluster of rocks. Ethan's pulse slammed painfully against his ribs. Shadow reached the vehicle first and barked wildly beside the driver's door. Ethan slid down the slope, snow filling his boots and gloves instantly. The truck windshield had shattered. Ice coated the interior. Walter slumped motionless against the steering wheel, blood frozen dark along one side of his forehead. "Walter!" Ethan yanked at the driver's door. Frozen shut. Shadow barked frantically beside him, paws scraping at the snow-packed window. Ethan forced himself calm. Breathe. Focus. He grabbed the emergency pry bar from the snowmobile pack and smashed through the remaining glass. Wind howled through the ravine while Ethan dragged the old veteran carefully free from the wreckage. Walter groaned weakly against the storm. Alive. Barely. Ethan wrapped thermal blankets around him immediately, while Shadow pressed tightly against Walter's side, sharing warmth beneath the freezing wind. Walter's pale eyes opened halfway. "Truck," he muttered weakly. "Think I scratched it." Ethan almost laughed from pure relief.
You stubborn old bastard.
Shadow whined softly beside them, while snow buried the wrecked truck deeper beneath the mountain storm. And above the ravine, the long dark forests of white pine groaned beneath winter's fury. The storm finally loosened its grip on white pine sometime during the night, though the mountains still groaned beneath deep snow and shattered pine branches. Morning arrived, pale and cold across the valley, revealing a town transformed into something quiet and wounded. Roads disappeared beneath drifts taller than fences, rooftops sagged beneath heavy ice, and several homes near the eastern ridge had lost power completely. Smoke rose weakly from chimneys where families burned whatever dry wood remained. Yet, despite the damage, people were alive, and in small mountain towns that fact alone carried the weight of blessing. Ethan Brooks stood outside Harold Bennett's mountain house beneath a sky the color of faded steel, while Shadow rested beside him on the porch. The old German shepherd looked exhausted after the rescue, snow still clinging to thick fur along his chest, despite the warmth inside. His injured leg trembled slightly whenever he stood too long, but his eyes had changed again. Less fear now, more purpose. Below the hill, snow-covered trucks and snowmobiles slowly climbed the narrow road, one after another through the frozen forest. Word had spread quickly through White Pine during the night that Harold's old house still had heat, supplies, and a working generator. By afternoon, the forgotten cabin no longer felt forgotten at all. Families arrived, wrapped in blankets, carrying children, canned food, lanterns, and tired expressions. Elderly couples whose heating systems failed. Ranchers stranded near the North Ridge. A school bus driver named Carl Weaver helped guide people uphill through blocked roads using chains on his tires and stubbornness in equal measure. Carl was a broad man in his 50s, with thick red cheeks, a heavy brown beard crusted with snow, and the booming voice of someone accustomed to calming nervous children during storms. Years earlier, he had lost his younger brother during a hunting accident in the mountains, and since then he treated every frightened child in White Pine as though the world owed him one more chance to protect somebody. "Hell of a place you got here," Carl muttered to Harold while carrying boxes of canned soup inside. Harold snorted softly. "Roof leaks in spring. Don't get sentimental." But even Harold could not fully hide the strange emotion moving quietly through the old house now. Rooms that had once held only silence and fading memories suddenly filled with human warmth again. Children sat wrapped in quilts beside the fireplace, drinking cocoa from mismatched mugs. Lantern light flickered across old photographs on the walls. Someone found an ancient radio in the kitchen, and soft country music drifted quietly beneath the sound of conversation. Ethan moved through the crowded rooms, helping wherever needed, without realizing how naturally he had slipped back into responsibility. Years in the Navy had trained him to organize chaos before fear spread through people. He checked generators, cleared snow from blocked doors, split wood beside Walter despite the older man's protests that a near-death experience did not make him fragile. Walter Jenkins looked rougher than usual after the accident. Bruises darkened one side of his weathered face, and his left shoulder remained wrapped tightly beneath his flannel shirt after Emily reset it during the night. Yet the old veteran refused to rest longer than 30 minutes before shuffling stubbornly around the cabin helping carry supplies with one working arm. "You're gonna reopen half your injuries," Ethan warned while stacking firewood beside him. Walter grunted. "At my age, every morning feels like reopening injuries." But Ethan noticed something softer in him now. The storm had frightened Walter more deeply than he admitted. Not because of death itself, because of Lily. Inside the cabin, Lily sat beside the fireplace helping younger children color on scrap paper Harold found hidden in an old cabinet. The girl looked different these past days. Still quiet, still thoughtful, but no longer trapped behind the invisible wall grief had built around her after her mother died. Emily Carter sat nearby, wearing thick wool socks and one of Harold's oversized sweaters, while checking on elderly residents sheltering inside the house. Her auburn hair rested loosely over one shoulder now, slightly messy from exhaustion, and faint shadows darkened beneath her green eyes after nearly 30 hours without proper sleep. Yet she still moved through the crowded cabin with steady warmth, kneeling beside frightened children, checking temperatures, handing out tea, calming anxious voices. Ethan watched her briefly from across the room and realized she carried the same quiet resilience he once admired in combat medics overseas. The kind of people who walked calmly into panic because other human beings needed someone steady nearby. Shadow wandered slowly through the cabin during the afternoon, greeting strangers with surprising gentleness. Elderly women scratched behind his ears, while children leaned against his thick fur near the fire. Every so often the shepherd returned to Ethan's side briefly, before moving again through the crowded rooms like some old guardian, checking the safety of everyone inside. Harold noticed it too. "Dog thinks this place belongs to him now," the old veteran muttered. Ethan glanced toward Shadow, lying beside a sleeping little boy near the hearth. Maybe it always did. By evening, the storm outside softened into slow, drifting snow beneath the darkening sky. Firelight filled the cabin warmly now, flickering across tired faces and steaming bowls of soup. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself surrounded by people without feeling trapped by them. Nobody here expected him to pretend he was untouched by war or grief. The old house held too many wounded souls for that kind of dishonesty. Near the fireplace, Walter sat stiffly beside Lily, while the girl leaned quietly against his shoulder beneath a blanket. Ethan noticed the old veteran staring into the flames with unusual silence. Finally, Walter cleared his throat roughly. "Your mama always said I was better fixing engines than talking." Lily smiled faintly. "She was right." Walter grunted softly. "Probably." The old man hesitated, weathered fingers tightening slightly around his coffee mug. "Truth is, after Claire got sick, I kept thinking maybe I'd already failed once as a father." Lily looked up slowly. Walter stared hard into the fire rather than at her. "And when you came to live with me?" His voice roughened. "I kept worrying I'd fail again." The cabin grew quieter around them, though nobody openly listened. Walter swallowed hard beneath his white mustache. "So I yelled too much, complained too much, tried acting tougher than I felt, because old men get scared too, kiddo. We just hide it uglier." Lily's eyes filled immediately with tears. Walter looked horrified by them. "Ah, hell," he muttered softly. "Now I've made things worse." But Lily suddenly wrapped both arms around him tightly. Walter froze completely, like a man ambushed by tenderness. After several stunned seconds, he slowly returned the embrace with his good arm. "I love you, Grandpa," Lily whispered. It was the first time Ethan had ever heard her use the word aloud. Walter shut his eyes briefly. "Love you too, Bug." Nearby, Emily quietly wiped tears from one cheek while pretending to organize medical supplies. Even Harold turned suspiciously interested in adjusting the firewood. The front door opened shortly after sunset, letting in a burst of cold air and swirling snow. Diane Brooks stepped inside carrying 2 large casserole dishes wrapped carefully in towels against the cold. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the climb through snow, loose strands of silver-brown hair escaping from beneath her knitted hat. She paused near the doorway at the sight before her. The old forgotten house glowed with lantern light and laughter. Children sleeping near the hearth. Veterans arguing quietly over card games. Shadow stretched beside Ethan's boots while snow whispered softly beyond the windows. Ethan looked up from the chair near the fire where he had finally allowed himself to sit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Diane's tired face softened into something Ethan had not seen directed toward him in years. A real smile. Small, fragile, but real enough to warm something frozen deep inside him, while the fire crackled softly through the crowded mountain house and winter howled harmlessly outside its walls. Spring arrived slowly in White Pine, like an old wounded animal learning to trust warmth again. Snow still clung stubbornly to the higher mountain ridges, but lower along the valley the frozen earth had begun to soften beneath sunlight that lingered longer each evening. Pine branches dripped melting ice onto muddy roads, the lake breathed mist into cool mornings, and the town itself seemed to wake from a difficult dream. Months had passed since the great winter storm, yet the mountain house above White Pine no longer stood forgotten against the forest. Smoke now rose regularly from its chimney. Lanterns glowed warmly in its windows at night. Footprints crossed the paths outside its porch almost daily. People had begun calling it Mercer House again, after learning Roy Mercer's name through Harold's stories, though others simply called it the Shelter on the Hill. Ethan Brooks stood outside the cabin one early morning splitting firewood, while Shadow rested nearby beneath the pale spring sunlight. The old German shepherd had aged visibly since winter. Gray spread more heavily around his muzzle now, and his injured front legs stiffened during cold mornings. Yet something peaceful had settled inside him at last. The nervous pacing, the midnight panic, the haunted look in his amber eyes had softened into quiet watchfulness. Shadow spent most of his days lying near the front porch, watching people arrive and leave, greeting frightened strangers with calm patience, like an old innkeeper who understood loneliness too well to ignore it. Ethan often caught visitors speaking to the shepherd, as though confessing things they could not tell other human beings. Perhaps that was because Shadow listened without judgment. Or perhaps wounded souls simply recognized each other. The work on Mercer House had consumed nearly every day since the storm ended. Harold Bennett supervised repairs from the porch like a grizzled mountain foreman, despite the pain in his leg worsening whenever rain approached. Walter rebuilt the leaking roof, one-handed at first, until Emily threatened to personally nail him to a chair if he continued climbing ladders before healing properly. Walter claimed he had survived Vietnam, only to be bullied by red-headed veterinarians. Emily replied that surviving Vietnam did not excuse stupidity. Their arguments became so routine, the entire house grew suspicious whenever silence lasted too long. Diane visited almost every day after finishing shifts at the hospital. At first, she only brought food, blankets, and donated medical supplies from town. But gradually, she remained longer each visit. She reorganized the kitchen shelves, created sleeping spaces for elderly visitors, and somehow managed to bring order to the constant stream of boots, coats, animals, and tired human beings moving through the house. Diane looked healthier now than Ethan remembered from the last years of their marriage, not because pain had vanished, but because she no longer carried it alone. The hardness of exhaustion had faded from around her gray eyes. Sometimes Ethan caught her laughing softly with Harold while preparing soup or teaching Lily how to bake bread in the old kitchen. The sound no longer hurt him the way it once might have. Instead, it felt like witnessing spring return after believing winter permanent. Ethan himself changed in quieter ways. He slept through entire nights more often now. The nightmares still came sometimes, but not with the same violence. He no longer woke reaching instinctively for weapons that were not there. The mountains helped. The work helped. And Shadow helped most of all, simply by remaining beside him through the long, slow process of becoming human again, instead of merely surviving. One warm afternoon, Ethan stood beside the porch repairing an old wooden railing when Lily approached carrying a cardboard box almost too large for her thin arms. "Need help?" Ethan asked. "No," she replied immediately, with the stubbornness she inherited from Walter. The box nearly slipped from her hands 2 steps later. Ethan caught it before disaster followed pride. Inside the box sat blankets, old dog toys, and several cans of pet food donated by townspeople. Lily smiled shyly.
Mrs. Hargrove from the diner says if this place is going to help abandoned animals, they'll need supplies.
Ethan glanced toward the porch, where 2 recently rescued dogs slept beside Shadow in the sunlight. One was an elderly Labrador with cloudy eyes, abandoned after its owner died during winter. The other was a nervous young cattle dog found starving near the highway. Shadow had accepted both with patient authority, correcting bad behavior through stern looks alone. Lily sat beside the dogs while Ethan unpacked supplies. Her chestnut hair had grown longer through spring, often tied back messily while helping around the shelter. Grief still lived inside her sometimes, but it no longer consumed every corner of her personality.
Emily showed me how to clean infected paws yesterday, she announced proudly.
Ethan smiled faintly. Dangerous knowledge. Lily scratched behind the cattle dog's ears.
I think maybe I want to be a veterinarian someday.
Ethan looked toward the open kitchen window where Emily laughed at something Walter muttered angrily over burned biscuits. You'd be good at it. Lily nodded seriously.
Animals tell the truth more than people.
That evening, Ethan and Emily drove together into town, collecting donated blankets from the church. The road beside the lake glowed gold beneath sunset, and for long stretches, neither of them spoke. Silence no longer felt uncomfortable between them. It felt earned. Emily rested one arm against the truck window, while warm wind moved loose strands of auburn hair across her cheek.
You know,
she said quietly,
a year ago, people in White Pine thought that mountain house was haunted.
Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Maybe it was. Emily smiled faintly.
And now?
Ethan thought about it carefully. Now, I think it's healing people. Emily looked toward him then, really looked, and Ethan felt something quiet pass between them. Not youthful romance, not desperate loneliness trying to attach itself to comfort. Something steadier. 2 tired adults recognizing peace in each other's presence. Back at Mercer House, lanterns glowed warmly across the porch, while townspeople shared food inside beneath music from Harold's ancient radio. Diane stood near the kitchen doorway, stirring soup in a large metal pot, while Walter argued loudly with Carl Weaver over baseball teams neither of them had watched properly in years. Shadow rested beside the entrance, watching everyone with calm, ancient eyes. As Ethan stepped onto the porch, the old shepherd slowly rose and walked beside him toward the lake path behind the house. Evening settled gently across White Pine. The water below reflected orange and gold from the sinking sun, while pine forests darkened along the hills. Ethan lowered himself carefully onto the old dock beside the shore. Shadow lay down beside him with a tired grunt, pressing warm fur against Ethan's boot. For a long while they simply sat together, listening to water move softly against the wood. Ethan looked down at the aging shepherd beside him. This dog had crossed storms, mountains, loneliness, and fear, not simply to survive, but to guide wounded people back toward one another, toward warmth, toward mercy, toward home. Ethan rested one rough hand gently against Shadow's neck, while the last light of sunset burned across the lake like quiet fire. And there beside the still water of White Pine, with spring wind moving softly through the pines, and the old dog breathing peacefully at his feet, Ethan Brooks finally understood that sometimes God did not heal broken souls through miracles that split the heavens open. Sometimes, He simply sent a faithful dog into the snow to lead lost people back toward love before they froze completely inside themselves. Sometimes God does not send angels with shining wings or miracles that split the sky apart. Sometimes He sends a tired old dog through the snow to guide broken people back toward each other before their hearts grow completely cold. Ethan believed war had already taken the best parts of him forever. Diane believed love could no longer survive silence. Walter believed he had failed the people he loved most. And little Lily believed everyone she loved would eventually disappear. But through storms, loneliness, pain, and long winters, God quietly kept placing light in their path through the loyalty of one faithful German shepherd named Shadow. That is how miracles often arrive in real life. Not loudly, but gently. Through small acts of kindness, second chances, warm fires in dark seasons, and the people who refuse to leave us behind when life becomes difficult. Maybe someone watching this story today feels tired, forgotten, or lost inside their own winter. But never forget this. As long as love still exists somewhere in your life, God has not abandoned you. Sometimes the road back to hope begins with something as simple as one loyal soul standing beside you when the world grows cold. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope tonight. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what part of the story moved you most. And subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about love, healing, faith, and second chances. May God bless every person listening to this story tonight. Protect your family, bring peace to your heart, and guide you safely through every storm life places before you.